have to sit down, negotiate, and come to a peace treaty, and that it can't be imposed by the United Nations. It can't be imposed from externally. It has to come from their efforts. I think this is an attempt to end run those negotiations, and that both parties should get back to the table.
That was Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird talking about yesterday's historic vote at the UN giving the Palestinian Authority new state recognition. Canada was very loud in opposing the bid, and today Baird called key envoys from the region to determine the next steps. So what are the consequences for Canada siding with Israel and taking such a hard line? And will the UN vote promote or hinder the peace process? Well, joining me now is Paul Heinbecker. He's the former United Nations ambassador to the United Nations, and in Winnipeg, Mohamed El-Rashidy of the Canadian Arab Federation. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. Now, Mr. Heinbecker, first off, I just want to get your response to Canada's position at the UN yesterday. What did you think of that?
Well, I think the government went out of its way to make a very, very strong statement in support of the Likud government of Israel. The foreign minister went to New York. As luck would have it, he spoke before the vote, which meant that the House was full and not empty, as it often is. And he took a very strong line, and the strong line emphasizing negotiations and the importance of negotiations. That's good, but at the same time, he didn't seem to be taking into account the fact that the Israelis also are at fault, and that the Israelis have been building settlements, and the settlements change the situation on the ground, and they negate the negotiations. If he had acknowledged that, as well as the responsibility of the Palestinians, then the speech would have been better received. But as it was, it looked like it was a very one-sided speech.
So, Mr. Heinbecker, do you feel that this response could have long-term implications for Canada?
Undoubtedly, we have taken ourselves out of the game in the Middle East. We are going to be regarded as not constructive, and we're going to be seen as kind of reflexively pro-Israeli, more Israeli, I should say, than many Israelis are, in the sense that former Prime Minister Olmert himself was not against the Palestinians getting membership, observer state membership in the UN.
Now, I want to go to Mr. El-Rashidy. The Palestinian Authority's chief negotiator had this to say last night on Power Politics. Take a listen.
There are 192 nations, including your nation, Canada, that has a sister country now called Palestine under occupation, and another country called Israel, the occupying power.
So how do you think Palestinians and their supporting nations in the Middle East will view Canada given the stance our government took?
And it takes a lifetime to, as the saying goes, to build a reputation, and only a few minutes to ruin it. And really, Canada, as the ambassador said, before a full House, taking the stand, going out of its way to be more royal than the king, and really ruining what we've built over the years. And there's no question that in the Arab world there will now be repercussions. And when we look at the Arab world, it's important that this is related to international law. It's important that we look at it as it's not a matter of picking sides. It's a matter of taking a very complicated situation and saying we want a two-state solution, taking a stand on the side of international law. We have a lot of investments coming in from the Middle East. The United Arab Emirates alone has $4.4 billion in Canada. We obviously want more. They have a $1 trillion fund. And the rest of the Arab countries as well. There's a lot of money. Qatar right now has the highest gross domestic product in the world. And so for us to throw these opportunities away for domestic consumption and for posturing that makes no sense at an international level is very unfortunate.
So you think broader implications?
Absolutely broader implications. You know, when we look at the history of how Canada got to this point to build its reputation, we can go all the way back to Lester B. Pearson in 1956, Hannah, when again you had Israel attack the Sinai and take it over along with England and France, and Canada, led by Lester B. Pearson as a foreign minister, took a very courageous stand to stand against the mother country, England, at that point, as well as Israel and France, and say gunboat diplomacy will no longer work. And that put Canada on a path of being a nation of laws, not gangs where, you stand with your friends no matter what they do. No, you stand by the law, and that is the best way to help your friends. And in that case with Lester B. Pearson, we eventually formed the United Nations Emergency Force, and that was the very first time in the history of the world that had happened. And something very interesting happened, Hannah, and this is a sign of how a country can benefit. Through the leadership of Lester B. Pearson, he ended up trying to get Canadian forces on the ground to implement the ceasefire. But the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, said no. And Lester B. Pearson was shocked because he felt that Canada had played such an important role as an honest broker in this situation. But Lester B. Pearson, being the man that he is, listened to the criticism and took it to heart instead of rejecting things you disagree with outright. And the reason Egypt rejected Canadian soldiers on the ground was because of the Canadian flag having the Union Jack on it and being essentially another copy of the British forces. And Lester B. Pearson took that to heart, and when he became Prime Minister, moved this country and led it, as leaders should, with the concept of having a new flag that distinguishes us from other nations, because we don't just hold the line with Big Brother. We have an independent motion, and that's how the Canadian flag was born, with a maple leaf that reflects Canada from coast to coast. And we see that lacking. Not only do we not have leadership, our population is very conscious, Hannah. We don't even have leadership. We don't even have politicians that reflect the will of the people.
Now, last night on Power and Politics, the spokesperson for the Israeli Foreign Ministry had this to say about the Palestinian Authority's bid for statehood. Take a listen.
It's kind of rather, I would say, bizarre for someone to come to the United Nations and ask to be recognized as a state when he only has control over 50% of his people.
Now, Mr. Heinbecker, what do you make of that point?
Well, I think that there is a point there, for sure. The Palestinians are divided. It's regrettable that they're divided. But ultimately, we're looking at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is trying to get to a two-state solution. And frankly, voting against this resolution at the UN only encourages the extremists among the Palestinians and discourages the moderates. What have the Palestinian moderates got to show for 20 years of negotiations? They've got actually nothing to show for it. In that period of time, the number of Israeli settlers in Palestinian lands has doubled. The number of settlements has increased enormously. Today, the Israelis have announced another 3,000 settlement units. That's on top of the 1,300 they announced on November the 6th, which was the U.S. election day, and the thousands of others which have preceded it. So essentially, what this issue boils down to, the reason why the UN is involved, the reason why the international community, and by the way, this is not an entity that lives in New York. This is the international community. If you have a beef with the UN, you've got a beef with 192 countries, and that's what I think we need to keep in mind here.
Let me ask you something. This is really interesting. Conservative Senator Doug Finley is watching this program, and he just tweeted this. He says, maybe it's time to re-examine our role within the United Nations, something we may need to look at in the Senate soon. What do you think of a comment like that?
I don't know what he means by re-examining it. Let me say a quick word about the UN. The UN is the international community. It's 192 countries. It's not an entity. It doesn't belong to us. It doesn't belong to anybody. It has no executive authority. It is basically a club, and it's a club run by its members. And what we've seen in this vote is that the vast majority of members, 179 member countries, disagree with us. We have the support of Israel and the United States, but with the rest of the support is Palau, Nauru, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Panama, and the Czech Republic. This is not good company. This is the kind of company that votes automatically with the Israelis. Countries like France and Italy, Spain, voted in favor. Countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands abstained, Germany abstained. None of these countries, these democracies, and they're all, the vast majority of these countries are democracies, voted against us. So why is it that we think our judgment is superior to their judgment on this issue?
I'm sorry that I have to end it there. Unfortunately, this is something we could definitely discuss for quite some time. Paul Heinbecker and Mohamed El-Rashidy, I really appreciate your time and thoughts on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.